Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Novara FM, brought to you by Novara Media and broadcast live on Resonance 104.4 FM, one of the last remaining redoubts of the old London, resolutely and obstinately broadcasting from amid the metastasising luxury apartments and glass spires of finance capital. I'm James Butler, and joining me in the studio this week is China Miéville, a novelist whose work will likely be familiar to many of our listeners, and now the author of an extraordinary narrative history of the revolutions of 1917, October. That book is where our focus will be today, but there's also a political dimension to all of the novels, I think, sometimes latent, sometimes pronounced, from the explicit concerns of Iron Council through to the astonishing exploration of the politics of language in Embassy Town, the immiscible and yet inextricably interdependent experiences of the border in the city, as well as an enduring concern about the urban, about the nature of cities, a theme which runs throughout one of my favourite of the novels, the loving take on the occult potboiler, Kraken, as well as all of that. Those who have followed your career know that you are a committed socialist, and I think we might talk about commitment and what that means today. And you're also part of the editorial team, collective, crew at Salvage. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
100 years. 100 years after the revolution, and in a sense, it's obvious, in a very banal sense, why one would write a book for the centenary. But it's not obvious that one would do so in such a manner as you have. And at many points during the past 100 years, it's been easy to talk of 1917 as an epochal event, a bursting forth onto the historical plane of a new thing, which alters forever the story of humanity thereafter. So conflicts about its meanings, about its origins, its replicability, its inevitability, its ownership rose and fell. And these were meaningful conflicts because what we said about the revolution said a lot about what we thought the world was or could be. And now the world defined by it is no more. And for many among the latest wave of historical researchers, the revolution itself disappears under their microscope. It disarticulates into mere happenstance, luck, more myth than truth. And it would be easy to write the blustering socialist defence of the revolution full of bad faith and bad hope. And that book has been written many times. Instead, you chose to write the story of a revolutionary period from February to October, month by month. And its protagonists shift and change, the expected Bolsheviks, but also the soldiers at the front, the many sympathetic left Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, the provincial Soviets, the streets which explode away from the kind of worried meeting chamber of the provisional government or the Soviet or whatever. Why this month-by-month structure, and what is the story of the revolution?
Well, I'll duck the second question for the moment. I mean, the initial idea was actually quite prosaic, which was without in any way wanting to sort of duck or disavow the obvious political questions and indeed commitment and so on. I and my editor, Sebastian Budgen, we were sort of talking 2 or 3 years ago, and obviously the centenary was coming up, and we thought that, it would be really useful and interesting, hopefully, to have precisely, unapologetically, a kind of narrative history, a popular narrative history for I think quite a lot of people who are interested, know that this was a really big thing, but literally just don't know what happened when. So there was very much a sense of trying to kind of prioritize that storytelling aspect. We kind of using the fact that I'm better known for fiction and trying to write it sort of unapologetically as a narrative with that sense of almost novelistic rhythm and acceleration and so on and so forth. So that on one level, it's just, if particularly if you're relatively new to the topic, and you just want to know what happened when in this extraordinary year, the idea is that the book will give you a good, rigorous, researched but non-specialist introduction. And then obviously within that, there are, sort of discussions of the politics, and particularly at the end, there's a certain kind of looking back and a certain kind of elegiac approach, I suppose. But the reason for kind of doing it as a kind of month by month, chapter by chapter thing was kind of emerged quite early on, which was the increasing rhythm of the events. It's sort of presented itself, and that sense of wanting to kind of submerge the reader into that kind of tide of acceleration. One of the things that was interesting is when I was planning it, when we were planning it, we thought we would be jostling in a really crowded marketplace. We thought, politics aside, irrespective of where you stand on the revolution, simply in terms of the importance of this, as you say, as a big story, centenary, we're going to be, it's going to be crowded. And for all the genuinely interesting exhibitions and so on, in terms of introductory narrative histories, that has not been the case. And that's been a genuine surprise to me.
And I think that's been replicated actually across media. I don't think, there hasn't been the sort of great televisual history that you might expect. There hasn't been the kind of endless radio discussion that you might think. And I think the reasons for that are worth exploring. And I think it's quite a depressing thing actually.
Yeah.
That people just regard it as the foundational event of a period of history that's over.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, it swings and roundabouts, because obviously for me, on the one hand, less commercial pressure, less competition for the book. On the downside, the triumph of a decades-long ideological project of reactionary forgetting. So, swings and roundabouts, really.
But I mean, I think the temptation, there could be temptations here about, say, sort of, the kind of post facto justification, or to say, okay, so here are the bits of the revolution that are important and that must remain, and to extract from from this story, a catechism of revolution, and you don't do that, and I think that's a good thing. Were there temptations here for you? Were there things that were difficult to look in the face, and were there surprises?
Surprises, certainly. In terms of difficult to look in the face, that's an interesting formulation. I suppose my thoughts would be that it was a question of kind of anguish, because for the most part, if you have, as I do, a solidarity with the revolution, hopefully a non-dogmatic and not uncritical solidarity, but a solidarity. A lot of these degenerations and mistakes, and indeed crimes at certain points, one's aware of them, one has a sense of them, but to kind of really start researching them and really see where this happened, where that happened, was painful rather than something that I felt like I had to kind of overcome an internal resistance, not least because one of the things that you find when you're researching it is that these were very contested at the time, including from within, the Bolshevik Party, the left SRs, their initially comrades, So it's not as if there was this kind of, ineluctable tide towards the catastrophe, and it's certainly not. And I think at its worst, the left has sometimes done this. It's not as if to defend the revolution necessitates sort of rather scurrying over those issues. I think one can take a leaf from people like Victor Serge's book, Victor Serge, who absolutely refuses to do this, including at that moment. Yeah. And of course, that also means understanding the extant without pitching it as, therefore it was no one's fault, but, understanding the constraints and the external circumstances and so on. So painful, very much so, yeah.
Talk to me about the surprises.
The surprises were, again, I sort of formally knew that, for example, within the Bolsheviks, despite the sort of the smears, if you like, of history, that there was a lot of kind of internal debate and so on. But when you're actually really kind of working through the literature, and I read a lot of the as many of the histories as I could, the sheer amount of like jostling, irritation, argument, disagreement, people getting things wrong, including people like Lenin, for all the kind of post facto hagiography and so on. That was not a bolt from the blue, but the scale of it was a real surprise. Also there were certain figures that I was surprised to find myself with what I can only describe as a kind of narrative affection for. So most obviously someone like Kerensky, whose politics were, invidious and appalling and confused and so on and so forth, but who it's very difficult not to find yourself kind of wanting to him reappear on the story because he's just such an extraordinary figure, And then there were the figures that I knew very little about, like Maria Spiridonova of the left socialist revolutionaries, who one of the surprises was the extent to which she ended up shining for me, and I wanted to know more, and I was really, fascinated and so on. So those were the things that kind of that kind of jumped out, and the sense of farce at times. Not always, but
I mean, she really shines out of the narrative here. I mean, I was left wanting to know more about her, and because I think it's, you know, and there is a sense, and we'll come on to talk about it, about that halo of people around or close to the Bolsheviks who are not Bolsheviks, who are, you know, they are the in some senses throughout the narrative, they bear the possibility of an unrealized future, right? And I think that's one of the themes that we can come on to. But in terms, I just wanted to pick, because you mentioned exhibitions, and I was and that question of kind of a long history of or a project of ideological forgetting, which I think is an apt way of putting it. And it really is possible to enter into kind of polemic with the enormous condescension of posterity. This is a phrase that E.P. Thompson uses about the Luddites, but it's now increasingly actually used in this case, as if every participant in the revolution were a dupe of a few central characters, or as if, you know, the notion of emancipation was not current or shared at all. I was thinking this when I went to see the Royal Academy show, which collects together some extraordinary art, and then curates it in, you know, an almost unbelievably offensive way. It says, you know, every artist was secretly doing something else. You know, Tatlin is secretly a mystic, as is Malevich, and you know, they're just having to, you know, make their art fit in with the revolution. Yeah, you know, they're never interested in the question of revolution itself. So I think there's a historical drift that's necessary to correct here.
And it's also just worth saying on that topic that, you know, a cursory look at the literature, at the letters, you know, at the diaries, at the discussions, just shows that to be flatly false. Like, you can disagree with these people, you can argue about their politics and so on, but the idea that there was not this immense, explosive fascination and drive towards precisely and self-articulately the idea of revolution, the necessity of revolution. One of the things that you see, for me, I think my favourite documents that I read were the letters from the front, letters from the rural Soviets, letters from the villages and so on. And repeatedly throughout the middle of the year, you have this yearning that, like, you know, we had a revolution in February, but it hasn't worked. Something's not, it's you know, it isn't finished. Something, we need more, you know, I mean, it's as you say, it's not just a condescension. To a certain extent, it's an insult, because you're kind of, you know, these people knew precisely what it was they wanted in many of these cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that struck me actually when reading the book was the figure of Lunacharsky, particularly at the beginning of the book. This is a guy who is fascinating to me, and he's very, very eccentric, actually. And one of the things I think that comes out of the book is actually how thick the revolution is with ideas and visions of the way in which the world could be different. And I mean, actually, Lunacharsky, relatively conventional tastes artistically. He goes on to think some very strange things and gets sort of all sorts of unfortunate things happen to him. But you know, it really struck me that there is one of the things that's made possible at the beginning of the book by the February Revolution is simply that potentiality is made possible.
Totally. And this, you know, this explosive kind of, I mean, we use the phrase carnival and carnivalesque, but for a reason, there were literally carnivals, you know, and these kind of, this amazing efflorescence of again, very explicitly a sense of total potentiality and so on. And one of these very interesting kind of reconfigurings of allegiances around a lot of these axes, these axes of potentiality. So Lunacharsky and Lenin, for example, who'd had a very fractious relationship for many years, you know, finding themselves, you know, abruptly on the same side in terms of this driving towards this explosion of alterity, and just to repeat, in various different modes, including the religious, but not restricted to it, that kind of groping for a sense of kind of radical otherness, complete renewal, and something that was literally unspeakable and unthinkable, a pleroma, was completely there on the surface, being articulated repeatedly.
It reminds me of Kristen Ross's book on the Paris Commune, Communal Luxury, where she talks about the astonishing explosion of creativity in the defense of the commune itself, that it
Absolutely,
legitimated these ideas, that it made them possible for the first time.
I think for me, this is one of the reasons that the various the particular kind of articulations of religion, of orthodoxy in particular, but certainly not only, and of dissenting sects and so on, are both incredibly moving and also incredibly fascinating in terms of kind of symptomatic reading. So you have, talk about surprises, you have, these sort of asides from journalists talking about how monks and nuns in the collective, in the monasteries and so on, are like overthrowing their own abbots reading the Bible as an apocalyptic, renewal text and so on. And some of the kind of dissenting religious traditions, not only, unfortunately, of the left. So you also get this kind of the Johannity, this kind of essentially kind of more or less explicitly fascist ecstatics, for whom the pogrom becomes an almost kind of holy act and so on. So that kind of apocalyptic discourse is everywhere. It saturates that year. And I think you're right, that's why Lunacharsky is such an interesting figure, because in some ways he represents a particularly pregnant point of connection between the kind of, if you like, mainstream Bolshevik and Marxist tradition and that sort of kind of yearning poeticized tradition.
So I want to talk a little bit about the left and the Russian Revolution, the contemporary left, as well as the historical left. And I suppose to boldly state, the importance of the Russian Revolution for the left is that revolution is possible.
Yeah.
Here is how some people did it, sometimes reduced to a series of historical laws about how it must happen. And possibly here is where things went badly.
Yeah.
And yet, I think your emphasis in the book, and maybe people won't notice it if they're not kind of familiar with the way in which this subject is treated throughout left history and the history of its reception, is quite a way away from it in some ways. And I mean this in a couple of ways. One is that your attention to protagonists of the revolution, who are not, for example, workers.
Right.
So it's not a story about the workers of the Putilov factory, for instance. They're there, but they're not the only protagonists of the revolution. And this gets away from the kind of schematic approach of some sort of rather doctrinaire Marxism that says, workers reach a certain state and then revolution happens. So that's one thing. The second is you draw from, I assume, Lars T. Lee and various works on Lenin, in drawing a portrait of him that doesn't make him a kind of supernatural political figure, but certainly a cunning political operator, sensitive to kind of tides and shifts in political mood, but really capable of error, sometimes kind of overweening in force. And this has perhaps implications about how we might treat his work.
Well, I mean, on the first question, the book, like all books, is trying to do more than one job, and there are contradictions. And so, as I was saying, I have my own politics, and I don't want to blur those. And those politics are very sympathetic to the Bolsheviks and that tradition, and the scale of what was done and was attempted and so on. But the sort of the first purpose of the book was, as I say, to present a kind of narrative story, including to those who aren't necessarily interested in, the politics in a particularly blooded way, not to foreground analysis in a way that's going to be off-putting to the non-specialist and so on. And that meant that, for example, some of the kind of details that may be sort of epiphenomenal for the real historian, if you like, for the professional historian, I could sort of detain myself on simply because they're wonderful anecdotes, they're amazing stories, and also that does mean, as you say, as you suggest, bringing sort of forth various of the kind of particularly colourful and remarkable individuals. The constant attempt is to kind of oscillate between doing it justice as a narrative and as a narrative history, and also not being misleading about the idea that that this was what created the revolution, that it was this particularly remarkable figure is the reason for it. Similarly, talking about the regions beyond Petrograd, like constantly trying to bring those in, so that there's a sense that this is an empire-wide phenomenon, in Azerbaijan and in Latvia and so on, and then sort of circling back to inevitably what becomes the center of gravity, which is St. Petersburg, Petrograd. My suspicion is that, again, I suspect, like a lot of books, that ultimately you can't quite square those circles. So what you do is you do the best you can do. It's a question of kind of failing as well as you can. So that attempt to get away from that kind of rather arid sense of iron laws, to unabashedly indulge the anecdotal as far as one can, simply because it's so beautiful and fascinating, to tell as rigorous a story as you can, and simply to keep people turning pages. It's a juggling act. In terms of what you're saying about Lenin, I mean, there has been, particularly under the work of people like Lars Lee, this kind of renovation of a lot of our approaches to Lenin and so on. And I remain, profoundly admiring of this man. And I think, one has to kind of walk, that doesn't mean, as I say, hagiography. It certainly doesn't mean never saying he was wrong. It also means putting a lot of his positions into a kind of historical context, which is something that Lee has done very well. And, not being embarrassed or worried or concerned about saying, he was wrong there, he really didn't help his own case there, that he was ducking the issue a bit there, which does happen because he was a human being. It's no particular surprise. So in terms of the one thing I think that I do keep coming back to with him is what Lunacharsky calls his ability to raise opportunism to the level of genius. And he doesn't mean it as a criticism. He means, he has an almost uncanny antenna for the moment, for the weak link. And I say almost because sometimes it goes wrong. Sometimes he's wrong. But nonetheless, compared to the other figures, compared to, wonderful figures, Spiridonova, Martov, various others, he does have this remarkable radar for when to push, where, how far, and so on.
And he's unconstrained by dogma, which I think is interesting in terms of kind of the reception of Lenin, because one of the things that's really noticeable is the way in which a lot of these forces are restrained by their kind of stagism or by their economism, and they're like and it gets in the way of like acting politically. And now I'm not a kind of anti-ideological actionist, but it is really, really striking about how these opportunities are missed. And it seems to me a unfortunate fact that the reception of Lenin has kind of boiled down, particularly in the West, into these kind of really, really arid cliches about how revolution happens, about what you have to do to make a revolution. Right.
Well, I mean, as you say, one of the things that is repeatedly remarked on again at the time is the extent to which and the ways in which he breaks from a Marxist orthodoxy that he himself was expressing, really quite a short time beforehand, and shocks his own comrades to the core in some cases with his own sort of breakings from that sort of position. So it was never an anti-intellectual thing. He's always attempting to kind of work out his own sort of theoretical and tactical position, but it does change, and it responds very, very minutely to moments, and is not scared to kind of go against certain sort of traditional nostrums of his own movement. You talk about, I can't remember the formulation you used, but again, it's worth pointing out that he is, famously incredibly splenetic and like rude, and so on about his opponents. And it's worth, you can say that that's not a problem. You can say it's a problem. Certainly, it's worth pointing out that many of his own comrades, A, thought it could be a problem at times, and B, would sort of say to him, dial that down a little bit. You don't, So I think that this is another of the paradoxes of, I don't want to parody, but a lot of modern day self-styled Leninism is not only that it has a kind of frozen and hypostatic notion of his own positions as dogma for today, which is absurd, but even down to a sense of kind of style and language. It sometimes mimics him in this unconscious but extraordinarily kitsch way.
Yeah. No, it's true that you find, I find it. I pick up a pamphlet or a leaflet. I'm like, wow, these are like fragments, like shawled against your own ruin. They're like pulled out of these kind of 100-year-old texts, and like the translations of
absolutely
of maybe 100, maybe 70 years ago.
There's something about the very particular, oddly stilted register of, particularly the kind of some aspects, again, I don't want to parody, of the British left, that one has this epiphany at a certain point. One's like, oh, you're riffing off 100-year-old translation. It can have its own poetry, but it's a little absurd at times.
Question about contingency, I think, and one of the things that's very, very clear is there's no historic inevitability about the course of the revolution. Although I think actually one of the things that comes out very early in the book is that kind of Brechtian line, because things are as they are, they won't remain as they are.
Yeah.
But the course of the revolution depends on an enormous number of contingencies, coincidences, and not only large-scale ones like the war, but also particular personalities. And that's true of Lenin, but it's also true of Kerensky. It's true of Kornilov, the kind of right-wing wannabe dictator, coup-monger. And for me, the contingencies get very difficult or very kind of upsetting historically when you think about Germany. You think about the failure of the Spartacist and then the 1923 revolutions. In a sense, and in fact, for Lenin as well, these are the things that would have sustained a Russian revolution. And in terms of the course of history, that becomes very upsetting. But there are moments too where it seems even within this revolution that things might have taken a different course. And look, I mean, counterfactuals are very often the preserve of the right. Okay, but there are moments that I think you suggest that had dispositions been a little bit different, the course of post-revolutionary history might have been changed as well. And I think that's true particularly in October itself, when the failure to bring together a kind of socialist, beyond Bolshevik government is a real error.
Well, I think so. I mean, the thing about counterfactuals is we all do it all the time. And I, in a way, I don't think you can think rigorously about history without thinking about counterfactuals as carefully as you can. You're quite right that it's not only a question of a kind of explosion of potentiality. There is also this sort of the sheer aleatory, the sheer, the contingent that gets thrown up. The one thing that does feel inevitable, I think, early on, like in January, is that this cannot stand. Like it might not be October 1917 that's going to happen, but something is absolutely going to happen because this system can't survive. And people are completely explicit about that. Then at the other end, towards the end of the book and in the epilogue, I think that the kind of primary sort of conditioning factors for what ultimately the catastrophe that followed were, I do think, sort of external and to do with, sort of the large-scale political and economic structure and so on, like the failure of the European Revolution, so on. But I do also think that from that kind of ground, if you like, there are certain subjective dispositional is an interesting way of putting it, factors that not only among the Bolsheviks, among their allies and their sort of conflictual allies, that one feels probably couldn't have solved the situation, but certainly might have obviated some of the catastrophe. Very, very early on, on the night of the revolution itself, the walkout of the left, of Martov's left Mensheviks. This isn't, I mean, to be clear, this isn't just the kind of, history, but, 2020 of history. Sukhanov himself, very, very close to Martov, writing quite quickly afterwards, and for the rest of his life, it was a catastrophe, it was a crime, we never should have left. Because there was, earlier that evening, scant hours earlier, not just an appetite for, a motion passed for a collective non-Bolshevik specific government and so on. And of course one can argue about the difference it would have made, but one can argue about the difference it would have made,
I mean, there are other things as well that occur to me, like, the bizarre hesitancy of Trotsky to take a political position. He wants to, maybe be press officer for the revolution, but doesn't want to take a ministerial position. Now, it's partly because he's aware that he's a Jew and he's worried about how that will play out. And yet you think it really could have changed the course of the kind of post-Lenin. Anyway, I mean,
that's a very interesting, that his concern about, giving succor to anti-Semites by being, prominent in the government is well known and a cause for argument. But your kind of further point about the difference that might have made is a very, very good one, and not one that gets talked about as much, actually. Yeah.
So
for me, sorry, go ahead.
Go. No.
Well, I mean, for me, maybe we'll get onto this later, but for me, one of the things that really does raise a kind of intense sorrow about it is what I continually, in terms of the dispositional factor, is a kind of psychologically understandable, but I think very baleful collapsing into making virtues of necessities later on. And this recurs again and again. And I think, again, I don't think it was causal, but I think it was at the very, very least deeply unhelpful, and in some cases fed into a particularly reactionary dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, so there aren't, I think, historically inevitable processes here in the way that we sometimes talked about through the course of the 20th century. But if there aren't strict laws governing revolution, if there aren't laws that are like laws of nature, what solace do we take from 1917?
Well, I mean, for me, I think on one level it is, as you say, the simple fact that, revolutions can happen. But I would go a bit further and say, revolutions against capital, against capitalism, against imperialism can happen and are sustained and driven forward by, a glimmer, but a visible glimmer of a kind of a sense of absolutely radical renewal, not just a kind of tinkering, but, a fundamentally different system. So there's that. But allied to that, for me, is a move away from precisely the inevitability you're talking about, to say not only was it this kind of, beautiful utopian vision, because that can be expressed in a very counter-revolutionary way. Such a tragedy that revolutions always fail, But precisely, I think this is where a concrete analysis does come in, because all of that sense of the kind of epochal glimmer and how moving that is as nothing if you sort of think it was doomed. So allied to that, for me, is a sense that embattled, denigrated, attacked, yes, but doomed, no. Yeah. And I think you have to be able to make that case to actually draw a concrete inspiration from it.
I mean, I think it's interesting the way that this gets inflected on the contemporary left, which is that, if we have to reconcile ourselves to a very minimal account of social possibility, a kind of very minor reformism now against the horror, precisely because revolutions always devour their children. This kind of cliche, which is an old cliche. It goes back to Edmund Burke.
Absolutely. Exactly. Before the thing I've said repeatedly at events for this book, and I'm completely sincere about it. Like, I welcome a serious argument about this, including with like right-wing historians who are actually prepared to make the case that it was doomed or that it was, whatever. That's fine. I'd much rather actually have that, because then you can actually have a serious systematic debate. But this nostrum that is thrown around that, like, are the tragedy, a people's tragedy, if you will, are the inevitable. That's not an argument, I mean, it's the evasion of an argument.
So there's a question about history and the inevitable, which is Stalin. And I think that's the meat of this argument. And throughout the book, I think anyone familiar with the history can, encounter these numberless and extraordinary personalities and know that they have like a very particular terminus inscribed for them, right? But Sukhanov, Kamenev, Bukharin, and Trotsky, of course. And you use Sukhanov's phrase about Stalin, the kind of grey blur. But that grey blur comes to define for many the meaning of the revolution itself. And the cliche of every reactionary is exactly that, that because of October Gulag, because of October show trials, because of October, as if the kind of telos of the revolution itself were in fact historically inevitable in its unfolding, right? But accounting for the historical arc does matter. And, you quote Victor Serge at the end, and I think it's worth exploring Serge a bit, because he's the most acute and I think unblinking chronicler of this problem. But, how do you deal with it? And I think the other danger that allies itself to these reactionary accounts is this idea, and again, it's something that comes from Burke, actually, is this idea that an armed doctrine revolution made in the name of an abstraction is always poisonous. It's always destructive. It's always going to destroy its participants. What is how do we deal with that? What is the best way of facing both Stalinism, but also this kind of, almost kind of foundational attack on the notion that revolution at all is conceivable?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to bring it to the book for 1 second, I mean, I had, if you like, the luxury, the sad luxury that is not the focus of the book. So the epilogue kind of gestures towards these questions and draws in some of the key issues that I think are important to beginning to deal with this seriously. And there's this odd, again, trying to do two different jobs, because if you are new to this story, then, the kind of roll call at the end of who dies when and so on is pretty wrenching. And if you're not, as you say, there is this sense of this kind of knowing the terminus. After having kind of brought in the factors that I do think are important, I think really the best thing I can think in terms of actually kind of accounting for it is trying to be as unflinching and as rigorous as possible and as concrete as possible. So not merely saying, not saying either, well, revolutions always eat their children, or, well, Stalin was a very forceful personality and therefore but actually saying, well, these were the social and economic conditions in 1921, and that means that you can make sense of the following decisions, including decisions that now look really bad among people that otherwise you would agree with, and so on. So inevitability is absolutely not indicated, but a kind of rational derivation of how we got from here to there. And as you say, one of the great tragedies of Stalin is the extent to which he feels really contingent in a good way for our purposes, early on. And Sukhanov describing him as a grey blur, and he certainly features, but he's by no means, one of the kind of leading figures, and certainly not one of the leading intellectual figures. Anecdotally, I need to kind of state an erratum for this book. There is a mistake in this book, which is in the dramatis personae at the end, the list. So there's a little potted history of all the major participants, and the one person that I forgot to mention in that section was Stalin. And not only did I forget to, but everyone else at Verso forgot to, right? Which I owe the reviewer at the Morning Star from pointing this out. Promise. And and I hold my hands up. It was a mistake, and it's obviously the most. I think it's the kind of the most symptomatic omission. The kind of unstated yearning in that omission was. I couldn't help but smile about that. As regards the Serge thing, I mean, I find that Serge quote that you're talking about, where he talks about the multiple possible outcomes of Bolshevism, very powerful, because, as I say in the book, generally it is deployed by anti-Stalinist socialists to say it didn't inevitably lead to Stalin. And I think that's 100% true, so let me be very clear about that. However, also in his quote, which doesn't get talked about as much, is it certainly didn't inevitably, but there were aspects of the practice that may well have cleaved in that direction, given other things. Yeah. And so he is both not exonerating, but he's both sort of defending, but also criticizing. And I think that's incredibly powerful, which he then does, he did around Kronstadt and so on, and I think there's no problem with disagreeing with him or any of the other internal critics, at particular points. That's a legitimate, if you like, debate among, that's a comradely debate. But the willingness to actually have that kind of unflinching, solidarity-based but critical approach to what happened is the only way we can possibly go forward, and not just constantly operating as counsel for the defense in a kind of knee-jerk way. It's understanding why we would do this. There have been a century of bad faith reactionary attacks, and defending the revolution, I think, is both understandable and incredibly important. But the best way to do that is not by the jerking of the knee.
Yeah, there's a line from Serge, actually, I think, which is really interesting in terms of how it now feels. And it's in 1913 when he's in prison in France. He's defending French anarchists, and he talks about the doctrine of French anarchism in this way. So he's talking about the anarchists. What had preserved me from their linear thinking, their cold anger, their pitiless vision of society was, ever since my childhood, my contact with a world imbued with tenacious hope and rich in human values, that of the Russians. And it's striking to me how much this could describe, not only Stalinism, but the kind of epigonies of Stalinism in the West afterwards, this kind of pitiless vision, this incapacity for, and he gets in trouble in the Soviet Union for befriending Mensheviks, for befriending, reactionaries even, honest but reactionary people. And this sense of that, I think it's this double duty that, for both defense and criticism. For him, it also becomes, I think, that question of how you deal with differing convictions as well, right? So that possibility of democratic plurality, right? Because he enters the Soviet Union. His description of this kind of moment of deep joy crossing this bridge, and he picks up a paper to read Zinoviev denouncing the demand for democratic freedoms, and then it's like this already something there that's and so I mean Victor Serge I love deeply,
but absolutely, but he was part of a current. I think that's and there are there are times when I think you can make a very kind of strong case for, if you like, a certain sort of mainstream Bolshevik position as a tragic necessity. For example, some of the issues of censorship around the Civil War. This is a legitimate debate. It wasn't all just kind of rah proto-Stalinists who were for it, but let's actually have that debate as they did at the time, until things became impossible. So Serge is probably the most prominent of the people who had that kind of critical but sympathetic but critical vision. Solidarity based, but we need an adjective for solidarity. Solidaritous but critical vision. But there were others, and they were, even their opponents in their sort of in their better moments would sort of acknowledge that was, they were crucial to kind of keeping that kind of culture of radical discussion and so on alive, I think.
So, 20 minutes left. There's a tonal shift through the book where this kind of latent apocalyptic begins to flash forth. So from the astonishing movements at the beginning of the year, things become more desperate with the war. They become more desperate at the front, they become more brutal in the street, hunger takes hold. And something I'm interested in, something that's been sort of floating around our conversation, is that kind of secularized religious sense about revolution, which occurs in revolutionary moments. It's not just a matter of tone, I think, but something which attends any talk about the achievement of a kind of new dispensation. Lots of silly cliches about communism as a religious movement. As if anti-communism is the secular religion of the United States. But I think this disposition is interesting, and it's interesting in a letter from a soldier from the front, which you quote, and I'm just going to read because I think it's incredible. And this soldier, Kuchlovok, I'm probably pronouncing it Kuchlovok, I don't know. And he sends it. He writes to Izvestia, which is the left-wing paper, Bolshevik paper. He writes, "Now another saviour of the world must be born to save the people from all the calamities in the making here on earth, and to put an end to these bloody days, so that no beast of any kind living on the earth, created not by princes and rulers, but by God-given nature, is wiped out. For God is an invisible being inhabiting whoever possesses a conscience, and tells us to live in friendship. But no, there are evil people who sow strife among us, and poison us one against another, pushing us to murder, who wish for others what they would not wish for themselves. They used to say that the war was foisted off on us by Nicholas. Nicholas has been overthrown, so who's foisting the war on us now?" And it's just an extraordinary letter. And, that sense of having achieved something, but it not yet arriving.
Deflected apocalypse. I mean, you feel it very much from I think that letter is from late July, and that particularly after the failure of the offensive, the Russian offensive at the front, that sense of deflected and stalled millennial change becomes more and more pronounced. I mean, yes, I think that letter in its original form goes on for 3 or 4 pages and is by some way my favorite document of the revolution. It's almost unbearably moving. And I think for me, that kind of messianic millennial sense within the revolutionary tradition, including Marxism, is something that I find not just very interesting, not just very kind of affectively powerful, but something worth defending. And I know that there are radicals and Marxists and socialists and so on who are somewhat embarrassed of that aspect. And I think I'm much closer to Lunacharsky here. You know, I mean, I certainly don't think it's the only aspect. I mean, I think, you know, it has to be kind of allied to what Lunacharsky called the cold stream of Marxism. But I think that is that sense, that kind of ecstatic sense of the sublime and the apocalyptic is completely constitutive to what it is to be human, and that means human as including as a political actor and a political agent, let alone as part of a program for fundamental social renewal. So I, if you like, unembarrassedly, as part of a kind of total, a kind of general approach to radicalism, see that as part of my tradition, and so it's no surprise that it recurs throughout the book. And frankly, it would be doing violence to the story if it didn't, because it was the way this was expressed repeatedly on the ground.
There's something about the moment of the October Revolution itself that has almost the quality of a miracle, right? These guards that change, these boundaries that are transgressed. It's just, you know, these quite minimal changes, almost pathetically, and yet also there's a sublimity to it which I think is astonishing.
Well, this gets to a question about language that I try to, I've been becoming even more interested since I finished the book, but is in the book, which is the question of the limits of language and the limits of language in radical politics, and there's a kind of metaphor that recurs throughout 1917, which is of words failing, and you know, you see it in some of the poets talking about the time, talking about language initially being scrubbed clean by the sandpaper of the revolution, but then later on in the year, words breaking down into the howl of beasts. And you know, I use a metaphor from a Chernyshevsky book where he writes the key passage of his book. It's just 2 rows of dots because the language is inexpressible. But as you say, this inexpressibility is the culmination of everyday words, and that dialectic, if you like, that what I'm increasingly thinking of as a kind of apophatic revolutionism is also something that I would want to defend and investigate rather than be embarrassed of.
I could dwell on this forever, but I'm not going to, because I want to talk about trains.
the other great metaphor.
The other great metaphor, right? And you highlight the theme in the epilogue, but let's kind of shadow it forth a bit. This network of iron roads veined through this vast empire, you know, connecting capital to province, but Russia to Finland to Germany. You know, Lenin's sealed train, Lenin the coal stoker in disguise crossing the country. It's also, to my mind, it mirrors the network of correspondence and idea which binds together the international, you know, papers and publications across vast distances, the kind of distances that no longer exist for us. And trains, in some way, seem to be the necessary technology of the revolution. Would it have been thinkable without them?
Trains and wires. You know, also the Hughes machine, these kind of early telegraph machines. No, I suspect not, is the short answer to that. But I also have to kind of unembarrassedly sort of hold up my hands and say that for me, they were... trains are important at least as much as anything else as a metaphor. And I hope that I can make the case that, for me at least, and hopefully for some readers, that's not, if you like, merely a filigree. And I have no problem with filigrees, but it's not merely, it's also a heuristic. It's a way of making sense of things. One of the things that I like, one of the few things I like about getting older is becoming clearer about my own fascinations over the years. And something has become clear about my own interest in trains, which is draws on this Bruno Schulz quote I use at the end, which is, we have grown up in a culture in which the default metaphoric resonance of the train is of ineluctability and a single road, a single rail. But there is a kind of occult counter tradition within, you know, fiction like Schulz, like Stefan Grabinski and various others, which is to point out that just as constitutive of the main line is the siding. And there's something quite interesting ideologically that is just abnegated in the mass of culture, which when I discovered that there's a line in John Reed and Bessie Beattie's description of the revolution where they mention in passing and say that they can't understand it, that the counter-revolutionaries describe the revolutionaries as switchmen. And I later discovered that the switch huts of the railways were where the revolutionaries used to meet, and this idea of the revolutionaries as people who are prepared to switch the kind of train of history onto a siding, onto a less frequented track, was incredibly powerful to me. So I think partly, there's something very kind of liberating symbolically for me about the idea of rescuing trains from the idea of ineluctability and thinking of them instead, relating to them instead as about a plurality of potentiality. I found very moving.
I mean, Marx obviously talks about revolutions as the locomotive of history, but this part of the epilogue reminded me of the scholion that Benjamin writes to the thesis on the philosophy of history, where he talks about revolutions as the emergency brake.
Right.
Really, which is, when I look at the contemporary world, is how I increasingly feel like that also is an aspect to it, which is particularly interesting, and maybe is not, it's the unspoken part of this tradition. It also reminds me of because the Andrei Platonov, the great Soviet novelist, who's the novella, really the foundation piece, just an extraordinary piece of melancholy and seriousness about what it is to build socialism. But he says locomotives and revolution are inseparable for him.
And although not in as explicitly a kind of politically inflected vein, you see this repeatedly within kind of Russian radical art. Khlebnikov, one of my own favourite figures of the kind of avant-garde, has a kind of constant return to a rumination of trains as a way of relating to history, and he talks about putting movable monuments on the platforms of trains, so you can kind of have monuments that move around, but the resonance of these images works, as you imply, precisely because they are also concretely real, that this is a territory of, defined by this kind of crisscrossing of rails. And you can watch the spread of radical ideas of revolution along the train lines, and the train lines and the wire lines. So you get, early on in March, you get sort of a diary entry saying, there's some word that something's happening in Petrograd, but nothing really is happening here. And then a week later, after some trains have arrived, like everything has changed and nothing will be the same again from the same guy. So I'm aware, again, in terms of the hot and cold streams, that there are some interested in these traditions whose skin starts to itch when one talks about metaphors and so on. And I would just unabashedly say this is, they work because they are both concrete and more than.
I want to take the last few minutes to talk about the contemporary. Now, there's a lot here that speaks to the contemporary moment, I think. Certainly, for me, I've been thinking about, since Gramsci, the question for us in the West has been posed less in terms of kind of assault on the Winter Palace, and trying to find what kind of thing the modern Winter Palace might be. Insurrection of the Leninist sort now looks quite improbable in Europe, if only because the army is much better armed than it was then. So the part of my question is about how we deal with the real conditions here, and I'm interested in your own work on kind of social sadism here. But I'm also interested in the question of pessimism. Perry Anderson once remarked that the kind of secret imprint of Western Marxism is failure, right? It's a body of theory precipitated by both failure and historical catastrophe. It's the secret both of its strengths and its weaknesses. It's caustic critiques, but the kind of self-lacerating resignation as well. Now, you're part of a project, at least partly in that lineage. There's other political lineages as well. And the themes of that work is about facing historical catastrophe and a return to a kind of historical pessimism as a method. And if I understand the position, it's drawing the poison of bad hope out. So is the present moment one in which pessimism is necessary?
I think so. And I should say that my own relationship to this was a question of kind of theory making sense of an effective reality, which is that, having come out of a tradition that for many years was extremely moralistic about lack of hope, or lack of not just lack of hope, but lack of sort of rah-rah optimism, and that sort of excoriated that as being in some way, objectively counter-revolutionary and liable to, lead to, the cardinal sin, demoralization. And what I discovered when I essentially was kind of freed with my fellow salvage editors to kind of explore the scale of what seems to me the problems affecting us, to not to not be moralized against for feeling pessimistic. Far from being demoralized, I feel more politically motivated than I have for many, many years, well over a decade. So simply as an equation, pessimism equals inactivity, I think this is fallacious nonsense and based on moralism and so on. So that was one of the driving things. And I think, obviously, on one level, there is a kind of utopian hope to any radical project. There has to be, because if you genuinely think there's no point doing anything, if that is, then there's no point doing anything. But I think that prioritizing that over a kind of hard-headed pessimism, if the times demand it, and that's the corollary there. Like, pessimism is not, or should not be, a point of principle. It's a question of a result of an analysis of a concrete situation. So it's not that I like to wake up in the morning and say, right now, to be pessimistic about whatever comes comes past my door. It's about saying, looking at the world at the moment. I love being surprised by joy, to quote Lewis. I love that. I was delighted by Corbyn, and I'm very excited by that, and so on. So this is not about a kind of Eeyore-ish wallowing in gloom. What it's about saying is trying to be concrete about the everyday. And this comes into what you're talking about, the stuff I've been trying to do about social sadism. I don't think history is, I don't think we just kind of keep on going through a thing called capitalism. I think it gets better and it gets worse and it gets worse. And I think that we are in, a historically particularly curdled and poisonous moment, and have been sort of certainly since, been moving that way since the 70s. And I think that there is a new iteration of a kind of overt sadism of kind of ruling class power that I don't think was there in the 50s, not in the same way. I don't think was there in the 60s, even in the early 70s. And I think that, I think we would be kidding ourselves if we did not face up to that and to what that does to general consciousness and so on. So there is one sense, this is where it kind of allies to the activism. For me, part of the point about pessimism, being pessimistic, I should say, is the yearning to prove that pessimism wrong. And that's constitutive to it. Does that...
it does. I mean, do you find this social sadism, does it touch the practice of the left? Because, I think it does, actually. There's a quite brutal aspect to a lot of kind of contemporary left politics, which is almost, apocalyptic in the bad sense.
I think it does. I've tried to talk about this in a couple of essays in Salvage. I do think it's worth making a distinction between, not sort of talking in sort of sweeping terms as if this is all equally bad. I don't think that at all. And I think that, the kind of new iterations of cruelty in the criminal justice system in the US are not the same thing as people being mean on Twitter. Let's be very clear. But I do think that, we are interpolated by neoliberalism. We're neoliberal subjects, among other things. And a degree of that kind of the schwärmerei and the jouissance in a certain kind of in shaming, for example, I think is a kind of mediated iteration of this. It's not only that, but I do think it's in part that.
Okay. One of the things I think, because I have a tendency to pessimism anyway, it's one of the reasons that I was never able to be part of the same political tradition you come out of. But it's one of the things that allows me to look at the Corbyn project with a kind of rational basis, in which you don't have to invest with you don't have to invest with the kind of be all and end all, because whatever happens on June the 8th, June the 9th is still going to happen. And so I think that's essential. 2 minutes left.
Well, in terms of the pessimism and bad hope, October is crucial to this, because for me, 1924, the triumph of the idea of socialism in one country is the triumph of bad hope. That is a point at which pessimism would have been a lesser evil. To say the international revolutions haven't worked, this is a catastrophe, but we have to face it head on. So, I hope in not too tendentious a way, there is clearly a relationship between my commitment to a kind of unflinching optic and this historical work that I've been doing. I think it politically matters.
You're a writer of immense imagination. We have 1 minute left. I think sometimes we need that kind of imagination. The French Revolution, the piece of Samizdat most circulated was a utopian fiction. What would winning look like?
It is, as I try to say in the book, I'm going to dignify ducking the question by saying that it is out of fidelity to the scale of the reconfiguration, that it is constitutive of me as someone who hasn't yet got there, that I can't answer that. Because in doing so, I would change myself to be capable of living in it. As the hope goes, so would we all.
Great. China Miéville, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.